The desert hides a secret that speaks in circles and echoes. Is there a truth buried beneath the sands of the Sahara? The eye in the sky sees a giant bull Si carved by wind, water, and time. But what if that circle is more than geology, more than scenery? What if it is a record, a page from a long-forgotten map of the world? Our question begins here, at the edge of certainty and wonder. The claim is simple yet vast: the Sahara may cradle a forgotten city, a memory of people who lived, thrived, and vanished, leaving only stone, salt, and whispers behind. Consider the ring itself. A circle tens of kilometers across, with concentric ridges that seem to pulse with history. Some call it a natural feature, a planetary accident. Others insist it is a deliberate design, a signal left by a civilization that spoke in circles as fluently as words. The truth, whatever it is, must lie somewhere in between. We begin not with certainty, but with curiosity, with a willingness to follow clues wherever they go, even if they lead away from the comfort of a familiar map. The first clue is scale. The feature is visible from space, a desert bullseye that stands apart from the surrounding flatness. Scale invites awe, and awe invites questions. If a human agency shaped this circle, what was the motive? A calendar, a shrine, a beacon? Or a stubborn proof that people once built with a knowledge that matched, or even rivaled, our own? The possibility unsettles, yet it also invites a deeper look at what counts as civilization, and what counts as evidence of civilization. Weather and time cooperate in strange ways here. The Sahara's ancient climate was different, with rivers that flashed across the dunes, wetlands that supported growth, and cycles that fed cities now buried. If a city once stood near the eye, its story would be written not just in stone, but in groundwater patterns, in mineral deposits, in the way sediments settle around a structure. The landscape itself becomes a witness, its layers telling a slow, patient tale. We must listen to it with care, balancing skepticism with humility before the planet's long memory. The possibility of a forgotten city carries a powerful drama. Imagine a metropolis that rose, flourished, then receded as drought, conflict, or shifting trade routes strangled its life. What did it look like? How did people work, trade, marry, teach their children under a sky that could cradle starlight and scorching heat in equal measure? If such a place exists, it would rewrite chapters of history, forcing historians to revise maps and archaeologists to redefine limits of expertise. It would force all of us to confront the fragility of civilization and the tenacity of memory. Two kinds of evidence come into play. Physical traces, like traces of walls or roadbeds, preserved as faint shadows by the desert's patient hands. And human memory, the oral and documentary testimonies of neighboring cultures who may have carried fragments of this lost city's legend for centuries. Both kinds of evidence demand careful handling. Neither should be accepted on zeal or dismissed on fear. The task is to weigh them with steady purpose, to separate signal from noise, to distinguish a compelling story from a dramatic tale. In this inquiry, science offers tools and checks. Mapping technologies, stratigraphy, and radiometric dating can illuminate when and how a site might have existed. Comparative archaeology can reveal whether a circular design aligns with known city planning traditions or represents something entirely new. The danger lies not in doubt, but in premature conclusions closing doors before the rooms behind them have a chance to reveal their contents. And so the journey begins with a hinge, the circle in the desert that could be a doorway, or a question, or both. The eye of the Sahara is our focus, but the broader aim is to understand how memory survives and how it can dissolve. If a forgotten city slept beneath the dunes, what wakefulness would it demand from the modern world? What new questions would it compel us to ask about water, climate, labor, and the human urge to leave marks that outlive us? Our approach is careful and patient. We will trace physical possibilities, test claims against evidence, and listen to the voices of researchers and guardians of sites who resist sensationalism. We will also place local knowledge, the stories, maps, and traditions of communities living near the Sahara at the center, not as folklore, but as a living thread in the fabric of investigation. Nothing here is assumed, everything is examined, from the geometry of the eye to the cadence of a legend that refuses to stay quiet. The challenge is as much interpretive as empirical. A circle in the desert can be a natural sculpture, a geologic mood, or a message left by hands long gone. Our aim is clarity without tyranny, curiosity without fanaticism, and a narrative that invites listeners to dream while remaining anchored in evidence. If there is a buried city, we will coax it into the light with careful reasoning, fair debate, and a narratorial rhythm that sustains attention without fatigue. The Sahara is a vast archive. The eye is a key. And the page is still turning, inviting us to read what lies beneath the sands. This opening therefore announces a journey that is both scientific and symbolic. It treats the eye not as a mere curiosity, but as a portal to a broader question: how do civilizations rise and fade, and how do memories endure when stones weather and stories shift? The road ahead will keep pace with the desert's slow, relentless time, and hope to unveil a chapter of humanity that the world has almost forgotten. This is where our inquiry begins, and where it may forever alter our sense of ancient possibility. The wind shifts, and the ground replies with a slower memory, as if the sands themselves are turning a page. We walk the line between legend and layer, listening for a conversation that began long before our time and continues in every grain that slips through a boot, in every faint line etched into ancient rock. If the previous circle promised a door to what once stood, the current pass reveals not a doorway but a chorus of evidence whispering from beneath the surface, urging patience, urging discipline, urging a patient clarity. In the quiet between dunes, there is a stubborn suggestion that the eye of the Sahara might not be a single monument but a crossroads of landscape and life. The ridges might speak of tectonic breath, the ring of albedo and color a record of sedimentary whispers, the symmetry of the circle a memory of design in a world that often forgets intentional performance. If there was a city here, the structure of its existence would have needed a web: water, trade, shelter, heat management, ritual commemorations, and governance. Each of these demands leaves marks, and marks accumulate in ways that survive longer than any single occupation, longer than the people who laid them down. Water has to be the first argument after identity. In the driest corners, a city can only endure through systems that store, move, and safeguard liquid life. Cisterns carved into rock, irrigation channels that serpentine along pale rock beds, wells tapped into ancient aquifers. These are not mere conveniences, they are the city's lifeblood. If a site once hosted a population, the geometry of its waterworks would shape its social order, the location of public wells near a marketplace, the clustering of domestic spaces around storage hubs, the placement of ritual spaces to mark seasonal abundance. The traces of such systems would persist as mineral deposits, subtle changes in soil chemistry, or alignments that point toward seasonal sun and moon cycles long understood by those who lived here. Trade would carve another path through the evidence. The Sahara sits at a crossroads, a corridor where caravans would converge, where goods would pass from oasis to oasis, from river to river, across long stretches of desert silence. If a forgotten city once pulsed at this crossroads, then we should expect to find workshop clusters oriented toward routes that are no longer visible in modern mappings, workshops where metal, ceramics, or dyes were once transformed into goods that traveled far beyond the horizon. The patterns of wear on stone blocks, the residues in refuse pits, the composition of ceramic fragments, these can all become a story of commerce, a narrative of connections that tied distant cultures into a shared economy of survival and exchange. Governance, finally, is the framework that gives structure to the other elements. The city's design would encode decisions about protection, relief during drought, and the storage of surpluses that could sway fates in times of scarcity. A public space reserved for assembly could reveal a political life beyond private dwelling, while the distribution of workshops and granaries might reveal an implicit map of power. If the circle is more than a symbol and more like a blueprint, its geometry could reflect planning ideals, perhaps a deliberate harmony with celestial events or seasonal tides of wind and rain that dictated agricultural cycles. Such governance leaves footprints in the distribution of space and in the durability of certain structures long after daily life has left the site. To read these footprints accurately, it matters to combine methods with humility. Satellite imagery can guide the eye, but it cannot replace the tactile truth of soil and stone. Geophysical surveys can detect hidden walls and corridors, yet interpretation must respect potential natural formations that mimic human activity. Radiometric dating provides a timeline only if samples are correctly contextualized. Misinterpretation here can mislead, so cross-checking with multiple lines of evidence becomes essential. The aim is not to declare certainty, but to build a coherent, testable narrative that can be refined as new data emerges. Ethics frame every step. The desert is not a stage for sensational discovery, but a living landscape with communities whose heritage and livelihoods are intertwined with its memory. Collaboration with local knowledge holders ensures that interpretations honor those connections, avoid misrepresentation, and prevent the erasure that often accompanies grand claims. Transparency about uncertainty fosters trust, inviting critique and collaboration, which in turn strengthens the argument rather than diluting it. As the investigation unfolds, 3 questions anchor the inquiry and guide the reader toward a disciplined hypothesis. First, could the Eye of the Sahara be a system of urban memory rather than a single site, with remnants dispersed across a wider landscape? Second, what concrete signs would decisively distinguish human settlement from purely geological formation? Third, how would a city adapt to the Sahara's rhythm of drought and rainfall, and what long-term traces would that adaptation imprint on the ground? The search book grows with every careful observation. Small deviations in grain size, subtle shifts in mineral composition, a concentration of flint or quartz near embedded channels, these minor surprises accumulate into a plausible image of urban life under the desert's gaze. Even the absence of obvious walls may speak volumes, suggesting a city built with different architectural logics, perhaps one that relied on nomadic patterns of settlement or a modular approach to space that left behind flexible footprints rather than rigid blocks. In pursuing these clues, the narrator stays close to the human element. The lives of the people who once inhabited this rough paradise matter as much as the stones they left behind. Their routines, choices, and daily rituals are the true core of the investigation, because it is through ordinary days that extraordinary resilience emerges. How did they cope with heat, scarcity, and danger? What kinds of social bonds formed to sustain collective memory across generations? These questions transform the field data into a living, breathable story, one that resonates with listeners who drift toward the calm of sleep yet crave the spark of curiosity. The desert's voice, when listened to with care, becomes a two-way conversation. The site speaks of human ingenuity, endurance, and adaptation, and our modern tools answer back with reason, method, and shared responsibility. If a city slept beneath the dunes, it would have left behind a symphony of signs, waterworks shaped with intention, commercial footprints that mapped paths across the sands, and social spaces laid out with an eye toward communal life in a world of extremes. The narrative thus moves forward not by triumphalist claims but by a patient, iterative synthesis, a process that welcomes corrections and refinements as more evidence comes to light. So the journey continues in a spirit of measured curiosity. The Eye of the Sahara is not merely a monument of geology, but a potential archive of human strategy under pressure. It asks us to rethink what constitutes a city, what counts as evidence, and how memory endures when time is relentless. The exploration is a mosaic rather than a single stroke, a tapestry woven from climate, economy, culture, and belief, each thread contributing to a larger picture of resilience and ingenuity. If the next chapters confirm some parts and challenge others, the gain remains the same, a deeper, more nuanced appreciation of how civilization survives in the most demanding landscapes, and a reminder that truth, like the desert, requires patient turning of many pages before it fully reveals itself. The night air cools and the dunes quieten, yet the story threads through the sand grow louder, insisting that memory travels beyond a single circle or a single site. If the eye of the Sahara holds a city's heartbeat, the next thing to ask is whether that heartbeat once pulsed across a broader canvas, leaving scattered traces rather than a single, intact ruin. The desert, patient and indifferent, does not reveal its secrets all at once. It teases with partial truths, and those partial truths demand a patient mind, a careful hand, a listening ear for the long cadence of time. We begin with contemplation of dispersion. A civilization might not anchor itself in one fixed place but move through a landscape as a living network, a web of habit, trade routes, water pockets, and seasonal camps that shift with the weather's mood and the caravan's needs. If remnants lie in multiple pockets across the region, then each fragment becomes a fragment of a larger map, a room in a forgotten citadel opened only when all rooms are considered together. The implication is not a scattered jumble but a deliberate mosaic, a design that hints at a planned distribution of labor, resource access, and religious or ceremonial spaces. To read this mosaic, one must assemble patterns across the terrain, treating distance not as a barrier but as a clue in a more complex architectural argument. The second thread asks for concrete markers that separate human settlement from geology's grand impersonation. A city, even one built under extreme conditions, leaves behind a suite of signatures, altered surroundings that reflect intentional design, not incidental processes, artifacts whose forms and wear patterns reveal purposeful manufacture, architectural alignments that steer sightlines towards sacred or practical horizons, and sedimentary records that betray organized activity rather than random deposition. Each signature can be faint, each signature can be contested, but together they offer a probabilistic case that grows stronger with every corroborating strand. The challenge lies in distinguishing legitimate urban signatures from post-depositional processes that mimic human organization, a task that requires cross-disciplinary scrutiny, transparent methodology, and a willingness to revise interpretations when new data arrives. The third thread concerns adaptation to the environment, the dynamic dance between culture and climate. A city under desert conditions would need to master drought, heat, and scarcity while maintaining social cohesion and exchange networks. How did dwellings, courtyards, and public spaces respond to extreme temperature swings? Did architectural choices emphasize shade, wind, and evaporative cooling, or did ingenuity lie in the timing of work, rituals, and markets to align with more temperate periods? The trace left by such adaptation would not be heroic monuments alone, but a layered record of daily life, the placement of storage areas to buffer against lean seasons, the organization of water retrieval in relation to prevailing winds, the siting of markets and sanctuaries near natural oases or artificial reservoirs. The long-term footprint of adaptation would show up as a sequence of environmental markers, from soil salinization patterns to microdepositional changes that reveal former watercourses long since buried. A fourth thread concerns the interplay between memory and myth. The Sahara's landscapes are repositories of stories passed down across generations, and the oldest memories can echo with the cadence of modern science when interpreted with care. Oral traditions may preserve the gist of abandoned settlements, the memory of caravan routes, or the recollection of once sustaining rains that no longer come. When these voices are weighed alongside physical traces, they can illuminate directions for future inquiry, highlighting sites that deserve re-examination or new methods of documentation. The risk lies in treating myth as evidence, yet the risk of neglecting it altogether is greater, for memory can steer researchers toward important questions that technical methods alone might overlook. A fifth thread examines how technologies can reshape the inquiry without overpowering the human story. Satellite remote sensing, geophysical prospecting, and stratigraphic dating provide powerful lenses, but the interpretation of their outputs must remain tethered to field realities and local contexts. The best outcomes arise when computer models, fieldwork, and community knowledge converge, each informing the other. This integrative approach yields a more resilient narrative, one that can adapt as techniques improve and as new archives are opened. The desert rewards patience, and the most convincing account results from a chorus of disciplines speaking in a common key. As the argument advances, the scale of potential findings broadens, yet the aim stays intimate, to illuminate how a civilization might live intensely in a harsh environment, and how memory preserves its shape when time erodes both geology and human arrangements. A city births routines of cooperation, competition, and cultural expression. It also seeds questions about sovereignty, ritual, and the kinds of knowledge valued by its people. If any such urban constellation once existed near the eye, its influence would extend beyond architectural footprints to the social textures that gave life to daily practice. Markets would pulse with exchange, schools may have educated the young in practical and ceremonial arts, and shrines could have anchored a calendar of seasonal rites that tied community to the land in a rhythm resilient to drought. To evaluate the idea of a broader urban system, one can imagine a field survey that maps not only visible walls but invisible networks, subsurface walls or lanes indicated by microtopography, irrigation traces indicated by subtle soil moisture anomalies, refuse patterns revealing everyday consumption and disposal. Each line of evidence forms a thread in a wider textile, and only through pulling the threads together can one glimpse the fabric of a desert metropolis. The exercise demands both bold inference and cautious restraint. It invites daring hypotheses that remain testable, not dogmatic proclamations that close inquiry. In this unfolding narrative, the eye remains a guidepost rather than a verdict. The eye of the Sahara as a diagnostic feature points toward a larger question about civilization in extreme ecologies. What are the minimum conditions for urban life, and how does memory endure when those conditions shift? The answer is not a single datum but a synthesis of many, stitched with patience and cross-checked against diverse sources of evidence. If the city's footprints are indeed dispersed, then the map of the past must become a network, linking sites across the landscape into a coherent geography of human presence. The ethical frame recurs here with renewed emphasis. The desert belongs to a living ecology of communities whose past is part of their present, whose voices deserve space in interpretation, and whose rights to protection and respect must govern every step of research. Collaboration, consent, and capacity building are not add-ons but core to the process of discovery. When the narrative moves toward wider claims about ancient settlements, it does so in partnership with those most intimately connected to the land. The night holds its breath, and the desert answers with a soft, steady chorus of tales half told. If the eye is a doorway, then tonight it reveals only a hinge, a quiet moment where the circle and the ground begin to turn together, ever so slowly. The memory of a city may linger in damp soils, in a line of stones half buried, in a pattern of footprints that never quite align with today's map. The next steps will follow these echoes, tracing them from the smallest shard to larger arcs, listening for the cadence that binds water to path, hope to labor, and ritual to daily life. In the quiet, the system of clues continues to wake and sleep with the wind, as if the desert itself is drafting a longer ledger, one that will require patient hands, careful eyes, and time. And so, beneath the vast, patient sky, the search endures, not as a verdict, but as a path forward, a slow, deliberate unspooling toward a fuller, humbler understanding of life carved into sand, stone, and memory. Night settles, and the desert's surface cools while echoes of a distant past press closer. The eye remains the center of attention, but the map of memory expands beyond a single site. A web of fragments, a lattice of traces, begins to emerge, linking places, materials, and practices in ways that suggest a civilization endured not in isolation but through a distributed memory. The landscape itself acts as archive, every dune and hollow a page turned by time, every faint mark a word spoken by stone and soil. Dispersion is the first thread. If a memory survives across the sands, it does so not as a lone monument but as a series of nodes. These nodes might be subsurface walls, buried courtyards, or damp pockets where ancient water once pooled. Each node speaks in a quiet dialect, telling of habitation and exchange even when the central ruins have vanished. The pattern of these nodes, their spacing, orientation, and clustering offers a clue that memory traveled along routes rather than being fixed in one place. When interpreted together, the dispersed fragments hint at a broader urban logic that once stitched the region into a living network. The second thread concerns the logic of evidence. The desert is a harsh compiler, layers accumulate with patient bias toward truth. Architectural remnants arranged in recognizable sequences, courts facing dawn, storage compounds near deposition areas, ritual spaces aligned with celestial events signal deliberate design rather than chance occurrence. But the desert also confers its own ambiguity. Wind-blown stones, eroded walls, ridges formed by erosion can mimic human planning. The challenge is to read the signs with caution, to pursue convergences across lines of material culture, ecology, and landscape, and to treat each sign as a possible element of a larger, coherent system. Water returns as the indispensable conductor of memory. A memory network implies access to reliable moisture, whether through carefully engineered cisterns, subterranean conduits, or seasonal reservoirs carved into rock. Traces of such systems persist long after confidence in the settlements fades, mineral patterns around storage pits, localized salinity patterns that betray ancient irrigation, and the subtle geometry of channels where water once flowed. Water shapes not only daily life but social organization, influencing where people lived, how communities formed, and when groups gathered for ritual or exchange. The endurance of these patterns provides a measurable thread to tie disparate fragments into a shared historical logic. Trade and exchange function as the memory's connective tissue. Even in ruins, evidence of long-distance connections can be detected in discarded beads, hammered metal, pottery styles, and residue analyses. A networked memory would show corridors of influence, material cultures that travel, technologies that diffuse, ideas that cross tribal and regional boundaries. The presence of such exchanges implies a socio-political system that depended on mobility and interaction, a social memory reinforced by economic ties that persisted even when formal institutions faded. The distribution of workshops, craft zones, and marketplaces becomes a map of interaction rather than a map of occupancy alone. Governance is the framework that gives order to memory. A dispersed memory network implies a shared understanding of space, stewardship of resources, and a calendar of communal activity that transcends any single site. The arrangement of public spaces, the siting of communal storages, and the placement of ritual or ceremonial centers reveal a governance philosophy oriented toward resilience, a system designed to optimize risk, to reward cooperation, and to sustain memory across generations. Even when ruins collapse, governance leaves a trace in the way remaining fragments relate to one another, as if the city's pulse persisted in how space was allocated and reused over time. Ethical engagement is the quiet backbone of the project. The desert's memory belongs to communities who live here today as well as to the stories handed down through ancestors. Collaboration with local custodians and communities ensures memory is interpreted with respect, accuracy, and accountability. Shared ownership of discoveries, transparent reasoning, and open dialogue about uncertainty strengthen both trust and the quality of interpretation. The memory network becomes not a solitary claim but a collaborative narrative that includes voices from the present as guardians of the past. Methodology grows from the idea of dispersion. The work moves from identifying potential nodes to testing their relationships through a multi-layered approach. Remote sensing pinpoints areas of interest, field surveys ground truth patterns, targeted excavations reveal the sequence of occupation and use. Isotopic analyses, artifact typologies, and landscape archaeology work in concert to reveal a continuous thread that links past settlement, trade practices, water management, and governance. Each step fortifies or revises the emerging picture, but never abandons the core premise: memory in this region is networked, not monolithic. The narrative voice remains patient, illustrative, and precise. The memory network is a hypothesis built from careful observation, cross-cutting evidence, and a sensitivity to local knowledge. It is not an assertion of grand unity, but a thoughtful proposition about how civilizations can endure across an unforgiving environment by sharing space, resources, and memory itself. If the eye is the eye of a story, the network is its skeleton, a framework that holds the weight of interpretation while allowing the flesh of detail to breathe and adapt as new finds arrive. The opening move is to select targets with care, not glamour. If memory threads connect disparate fragments, the first task is to test those connections against the Earth itself. A systematic survey grid, informed by the dispersed node hypothesis, guides investigators to clusters where signs of habitation, water management, or storage might survive beneath the surface. Each survey point is a question, and each answer is a hint that the landscape is more than a postcard of dunes. It is a choir of microsites, each contributing a voice to the broader chorus of settlement, adaptation, and memory. Next comes the realization that extraction must be reversible in principle and transparent in practice. Excavation plans are built around the sacred triad of context, stratigraphy, and documentation. Context preserves the relationship of artifacts to their original position, a chain of evidence that anchors interpretation in reality rather than conjecture. Stratigraphy lays time itself bare, with each soil layer narrating a distinct phase of occupation, use, or abandonment. Documentation captures every movement, the exact square foot removed, the color and texture of each stratum, the position of a ceramic fragment, the orientation of a pit, the correlation of a wall with a water channel. The aim is to record sharply, to reveal quietly, and to refrain from overstepping the boundary between discovery and narrative fabrication. A crucial instrument in this work is the calibration of dating methods with context. Absolute dating, radiocarbon, luminescence, and specialized isotopic analyses must be grounded in robust stratigraphic placement and cross-validated with artifact typologies and architectural sequencing. Relative dating, though inherently less definitive, gains strength when multiple lines of evidence point to a common chronology. The result is not a single date but a timeline that breathes with the site, periods of construction, episodes of repair, phases of storage, and moments of ritual assembly. Material culture becomes the archive's most tangible voice. Pottery sherds, metal objects, beads, and bone tools perform an eloquent calculus of exchange, technology, and function. The stylistic language of pottery indicates regional interactions, while metallurgical remnants reveal technological transitions and resource networks. Each recovered artifact is contextualized within a broader framework: how it traveled, who used it, what it symbolized, so that the fragment becomes a participant in a living historical dialogue rather than an isolated relic. Water storage and usage are revisited with sharpened attention. If the dispersed memory framework is correct, traces of cisterns, aqueduct-like channels, terracing, and recharge ponds will align across sites in a pattern that supports a coordinated strategy for drought resilience. The spatial relationships among wells, living spaces, and communal areas provide a map of daily life, revealing how communities prioritized access to moisture, managed risk during scarce years, and integrated water-related rituals into the social fabric. Examining mineralization, salts, and soil moisture anomalies offers a chronological lens on the evolving water economy. Carrying capacity and settlement dynamics emerge as synthetic lenses for interpretation. The size of courtyards, the scale of granaries, and the footprint of public spaces reflect decisions about population density, food security, and social ritual. Isolated compounds may indicate seasonal or specialized activity, while denser clusters near water sources suggest sustainable urban cores. By synthesizing spatial measurements with material inventories, investigators construct a probabilistic model of everyday life, one that accommodates variation across nodes while maintaining a coherent overall pattern of urban organization. Ethical stewardship grounds every action in the field. Local communities, custodians of memory and landscape, deserve an active voice in shaping questions, methods, and dissemination. Collaborative partnerships, shared documentation, and open access to data ensure the research respects the people most closely tied to the land while strengthening the credibility and reach of the findings. The field becomes a space of joint inquiry rather than a unilateral excavation, a place where knowledge advances through dialogue, transparency, and accountability. Narrative discipline guides how results are presented. The team should avoid sensational storytelling or premature generalizations. Instead, it builds a careful narrative that weaves observation, method, and interpretation into a coherent arc. Each chapter of the field log contributes a piece to the larger puzzle, and the reader is invited to follow the chain of reasoning from raw data to interpretive synthesis with the same patience required to hear a desert wind through multiple nights. A layered climate reveals a layered history. In wetter intervals, the landscape could sustain denser settlements, more intensive farming, and longer trading cycles. In harsher periods, settlements shrink, paths tighten, and memory migrates toward more compact, fortified pockets. The record lies in the soil, in the subtle shifts of moisture, salinity, and sediment texture that signal changes in water availability and vegetal cover. Studying these markers, one sees how people adapted by altering architectural forms, relocating sites, and reconfiguring social routines to survive drought, heat, and scarce resources. Water remains the most persuasive thread in this narrative. The availability and movement of water not only sustain life, they structure life. The traces of wells, cisterns, and channel networks, when analyzed in their spatial contexts, reveal a logic of settlement, clusters aligned with the anticipated flow of groundwater, corridors that channel flood-derived nutrients, and reservoirs positioned to buffer seasonal variability. Each edge of a habitation block speaks to a calculation of risk, a decision to place daily necessity within reach of communal spaces, and a long view of a landscape that demanded resilience rather than conquest. Trade and mobility take on a new role as climate memory carriers. Caravans adjust routes in response to shifting oases, wind patterns, and salt availability. The distribution of craft zones, raw material sources, and exchange nodes echoes a memory of interregional connection. Even when sites are abandoned, the trace of exchange persists in tool styles, ceramic temper, and metalwork techniques, bearing testimony to networks that sustain communities across seasons of scarcity. The climate thus acts as both constraint and catalyst, shaping how people innovated, organized, and remembered. The social architecture of memory grows clearer when the environment is read as a participant, not merely a stage. Public spaces, courtyards, and pathways align with the rhythms of rainfall, temperature, and wind. Houses designed to catch breezes, courtyards shaded by windward walls, and storage spaces oriented toward anticipated dust and dryness reveal a social engineering that sought stability amidst capricious weather. The memory of such design endures in the spatial logic of surviving settlements, offering clues to how communities prioritized safety, warmth, and social cohesion during times of environmental stress. Environmental signals also carry the weight of time. The persistence or disappearance of certain plant remains, pollen signatures, and soil stratigraphy can indicate shifts in land use and agricultural strategy across generations. The way landscapes recover after disturbances, natural or human-made, speaks to a society's capacity to reorganize, relearn, and reallocate resources. These responses become part of the desert's own memory, a palimpsest of adaptation that future researchers can decipher in concert with artifacts and architectural remnants. Ethics governs this ecological memory as stringently as it guides any architectural interpretation. Local communities retain intimate knowledge of the land and its moods. Their voices offer essential context and calibration for any climate interpretation. Respectful collaboration ensures that environmental reconstructions honor living relationships with the land and uphold the integrity of cultural heritage. Open dialogues about uncertainty enable inclusive narratives that reflect rather than exceed what the data can support. The desert's role as corridor becomes explicit through the study of trade routes that braided through its heart. A caravan city is not only a node of shelter but a synapse in a vast nervous system of commerce. Goods moved, but so did techniques, religious ideas, and social practices. Salt and gold, the famous currencies of the Trans-Saharan corridor, stood beside textiles, ceramics, and scientific knowledge. Each exchange left a residue in the form of material culture, the design motifs of pottery, the tempering of metals, the refined artistry of beadwork. The distribution of such artifacts across sites reveals a history of mobility that far surpasses what any single settlement could claim. In these traces, memory travels as reliably as goods, carried by itinerant traders and returning with stories, technologies, and words that mingle across cultures. Language itself becomes a living bridge in this narrative. Multilingual interactions thrived where roots intersected, birthing a shared commercial idiom infused with religious terminology, mathematical shorthand for accounting, and diplomatic phrases employed during exchanges. While the desert's harsh climate tested endurance, it also offered a platform for exchange that transcended borders. The memory network thus expands to include not just physical architecture but the intangible architecture of language, customs, and reciprocity. The richness of these cross-cultural exchanges reveals a world where desert life was not isolated but inherently cosmopolitan, a paradox that makes the Eye of the Sahara all the more compelling as a symbol of connection. Political dynamics weave into this tapestry with equal significance. The movement of rulers, administrators, and soldiers across desert thresholds created patterns of influence that reached from inland oases to coastal ports. The desert served as a conduit for political ideas, administrative practices, and military technologies, all carried along with caravans and pilgrims. When empires rose and fell, the roots did not vanish, they transformed, shifting channels of power while leaving behind infrastructural breadcrumbs, road hubs, relay stations, fortified outposts, and caravanserais that once sustained the flow of authority as reliably as water sustained life. Memory records these transformations in the alignment of settlements, the evolution of boundary zones, and the persistence of ritual centers linked to state power. This section also invites attention to the less visible actors who shape desert history. Nomadic groups, migrant artisans, and itinerant scholars moved between permanent settlements, playing a critical role in the diffusion of knowledge and practice. Their mobility enabled the exchange of ideas without leaving obvious imperial footprints. Their presence inflects the memory narrative, reminding readers that history is not only written by the residents of walled towns but by the travelers who crossed dunes and traded in the margins between sedentary life and roaming livelihoods. The memory network grows more robust when it accounts for these transitional figures who bridged worlds through trade, marriage, and mentorship. Ethical considerations anchor the exploration of cross-cultural memory. Respect for the communities whose histories unfold across these landscapes remains essential, as does a commitment to inclusive interpretation. Local perspectives can counterbalance over-ambitious generalizations and ensure that the account honors nuanced regional histories rather than forcing a simplistic, homogenized arc. Collaborative research practices, transparency about uncertainties, and shared stewardship of results preserve trust and integrity in the storytelling process. Across deserts, similar pressures yield similar responses, but how those responses are styled tells a richer tale. In some regions, long-distance exchange coalesced into dense urban cores with monumental architecture, while in others the pattern favored dispersed settlements and cluster hubs that emphasized mobility and flexibility. The memory network grows more complex as researchers test the extent of these parallels and the reasons behind any divergences. Are divergences the product of resource constraints, differing climate histories, or divergent social norms that shaped how communities negotiated risk and opportunity? Each question helps peel back layers of time to reveal the underlying logic of desert life. Trade becomes a key comparative metric. The same goods, salt, metal, pottery, and textiles traveled along different arterial routes, leaving a footprint in material culture that can be traced across landscapes. The study of artifact distributions, residue analyses, and route lane patterns can illuminate how desert economies connected distant societies. When patterns align across regions, they point to a shared logic of exchange and mutual dependence. When patterns diverge, they reveal local adaptations and unique cultural inventions. Either outcome deepens our understanding of how memory travels, not as a straight line but as a braided path that weaves through terrain, technology, and social memory. Governance and social organization are another axis of comparison. The desert-esque governance models from council-led communities to more centralized authorities shape how memory is preserved, transmitted, and ritualized. A networked memory in one region might rely on recurring communal assemblies and seasonal ritual cycles, while another could depend on durable monumental forms that encode a political narrative through architecture and iconography. The comparison helps illuminate how memory is stabilized by institutions even as landscapes change under climate and economic pressure. It also highlights the moral stakes of interpretation, to honor local governance traditions rather than impose a universal model of what a city should look like. Environmental history continues to intersect with memory in powerful ways. The same climatic rhythms, periods of rainfall, drought, and oscillating vegetation leave fingerprints across desert regions. Reconstructing these patterns allows cross-regional testing of hypotheses about settlement resilience, migration, and the timing of cultural shifts. The interplay between environment and memory is not a deterministic script but a dynamic conversation in which communities respond with adaptive strategies tailored to local ecologies, technologies, and social networks. The resulting narrative therefore respects both regional specificity and overarching human ingenuity. Ethics, again, anchors the endeavor. Cross-regional memory work must be collaborative, inclusive, and transparent. Engaging with local communities, respecting intangible heritage, and sharing data openly are essential to building a trustworthy, globally informed account. This ethical stance ensures that the story of desert memory does not become a solitary voice but a chorus that includes diverse perspectives, languages, and know-how. It also guards against romanticizing the past or erasing current realities, balancing curiosity with responsibility. Methodological bridges are built with care. The cross-regional analysis relies on harmonized frameworks that allow comparison without reducing distinctions. Standardized data collection, even as it remains flexible to local contexts, ensures that evidence from different deserts can be meaningfully aggregated. It involves synthesizing material culture, settlement patterns, hydrology, climate proxies, and oral histories into a coherent comparative narrative. The goal is not simply to confirm similarities but to uncover the conditions that produce both convergence and diversity in desert memory. Case Study 1 centers on a cluster of nodes adjacent to an ancient river corridor that no longer exists on the surface map. Here the memory network can be traced through a layered sequence, a riverine settlement with densely packed domestic spaces, followed by a shift toward more dispersed, modular layouts as the climate shifted. The material signatures include a progression from locally produced pottery to imported wares, and a subtle migration of workshop zones toward higher ground with better drainage and wind patterns. The hydrologic indicators, subterranean channels, storage pits, and calcareous encrustations offer a coherent narrative of a community that restructured its water economy in response to diminishing flow. This site asks, when water becomes unreliable, does memory pivot toward resilience through diversification, or does it compress settlement into tighter, more protective spaces? The evidence anticipates an answer: resilience through adaptive reorganization anchored in accessible water and diversified livelihood strategies. Case Study 2 examines a hillside complex where ritual and governance coalesce. The architecture emphasizes ceremonial thresholds, courtyards oriented to particular celestial events, and a clearage between sacred and secular spaces. The distribution of artifacts, beadwork with cosmological symbolism, metal remnants with standardized dimensions, and ceramic forms reflecting a shared regional idiom suggests a governance framework that relies on ritual legitimacy as a binding social force. A key question emerges: do these ceremonial layouts function as memory keepers, preserving shared identity across generations while also enabling practical governance through predictable spatial routines? The case suggests yes, the ritual calendar and public assembly spaces reinforce social cohesion even when the landscape imposes daily pressures. Case Study 3 explores a peripheral outpost reflecting cross-regional exchange. Its economic footprint shows a deliberate mix of locally sourced materials and imported goods that traveled long routes through the desert economy. The evidence includes trace elements in pottery that align with distant production centers, metallurgical residues that indicate imported ore, and documented repair activities that reveal ongoing maintenance of exchange networks. The memory implication is twofold. First, memory is sustained through ongoing exchange and social memory around value and reciprocity. Second, the outpost demonstrates how memory threads can survive even when central authority wanes, thanks to a robust economy of permeability and adaptability. This site invites reflection on how memory depends on both the durability of relationships and the flexibility of material infrastructures. Across all three sites, a common methodological thread emerges. The strongest narratives arise from converging multiple lines of evidence: spatial analysis, material culture, environmental proxies, and local testimony. Each site tests a portion of the broader hypothesis that desert memory exists as interconnected patterns rather than isolated monuments, and each adds a constraint that refines the overall model. The synthesis emphasizes that memory is not a static relic but a dynamic archive that records choices, constraints, and creative responses to environmental and social pressures. Ethical posture remains central. Field teams work with local communities to ensure respectful research and shared benefit. The case studies underscore the importance of transparent data handling, publication of intermediate findings, and collaborative interpretation. By foregrounding local voices and boundary conditions, the narrative protects against overreach while still pursuing a rigorous, evidence-based account. Night settles over the vast desert again, and the memory map you have built across 8 chapters feels like a living atlas, one that has grown with each new route, each shared tale, and each careful measurement. The eye remains a beacon, but it no longer stands alone. It glows through the converging lines of water, trade, governance, climate, and memory, forming a composite that is as much about humanity's patience as about the stones beneath the dunes. This finale does not seek a final verdict but a durable understanding, a careful synthesis that honors the complexity of desert life and the ambition that carried people to endure, adapt, and remember. The journey thus far has shown that memory endures not as a single, intact ruin but as a chain of remembered events, an interconnected chain that links what existed, what moved, and what endured through time. Each fragment tested by evidence has become part of a larger argument that memory in the desert is resilient, collaborative, and context-sensitive. It is reinforced by water management, by networks of exchange, by governance that balances risk with ritual, and by the creative responses of communities to climate shifts. The chain's strength lies in its diversity, with multiple sites, multiple lines of evidence, multiple voices, yet with a shared logic that binds them into a plausible, testable narrative. The synthesis invites a broader, more reflective consideration of what a desert civilization can be. It suggests that urban memory can survive even when roofs collapse and walls crumble, if the social memory remains embedded in the way spaces are used, how resources flow, and how people renew each other's sense of belonging. It also implies that the desert can teach a universal lesson about resilience. Memory is less about preservation in formal structures than about the continuing capacity to reinterpret space, regulate resources, and maintain identity amid changing conditions. In this sense, the eye is not merely a relic to be documented but a living prompt, a reminder that memory can evolve as landscapes change, that knowledge travels in many forms, and that the social fabric can adapt without erasing its roots. The ethical core of this work remains central to the closing. The desert's histories belong to the communities who live beside it, to the descendants who carry stories and memory forward, and to researchers who bear responsibility for how discoveries are shared. The obligation is to present findings with honesty, to acknowledge uncertainties, and to invite ongoing collaboration. By situating memory within a web of voices from local custodians to field researchers, the narrative preserves the integrity of the past while ensuring it remains a resource for the present and future. The goal is not to claim absolute certainty but to offer a robust framework for understanding, one that can welcome new evidence without dissolving into ambiguity.